Thanks very much,
well,
Deputy.
thank you.
And now we have Deputy Claire Daly and Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett who are sharing 20 minutes.
Thanks, Ciarán Comhairle.
Will I tell you when you're 10 minutes?
I may not need them, Okay. Thanks, Ciarán Comhairle. Obviously, this is an aspect of the discussion on reform in education, and in that context, quite important. There are much bigger issues, clearly, in that regard, big projects with regard to the need to have patronage examined, the whole area of secularisation in education and overall standards in that as well, which are probably of far more consequence than some of the measures in this. But that said, I do think all of these discussions, including this one, can't be divorced from the overall question of resources and investment in education itself, because to talk about reform in the context of a butchering of funding and an inadequate funding situation really gives a lopsided debate, because if anything we need more investment in education, particularly now in these pressing economic times, that investment ultimately will pay off and be beneficial not just to the individuals but to society as a whole. Now, I think this bill in particular really deals with mainly the issues of redeployment and standards, and with regard to the first, I note that there isn't really much objections from any of the trade unions with regard to the whole issue of redeployment, presumably because many of these measures have been agreed within Croke Park. And I think the change in the situation where the Minister previously decided such procedures with regard to appointment, redeployment and dismissal, that being gone from a position of where he had to have the agreement of the partners to one where he's required to consult, is fine as far as I'm concerned, because a lot of the decision making ultimately rests with the board of the school and the principal with regard to the detail, and I think that is absolutely appropriate. I just wanted to deal with two issues in particular, one being the abolition of the Education Disadvantage Committee and the other dealing with the issue of the Teaching Council itself. With regard to the first, it is the case that obviously this committee hasn't really been active since 2005, and the government have argued that its role has been largely taken up by the DEIS programme. I do note that said that the Federation of University Teachers did raise some concerns about that it may continue to, if you like, fuel disadvantage in education. But I think the retort of the Department with regard to ongoing and continuing work in combating disadvantage has to be seriously questioned, and I think we can't look at this measure in isolation. Particularly the attacks made recently on the DEIS schools, which obviously the intervention of parents and teachers and so on have altered, but we do have to look at it in funding. It's my belief that the County Dublin VEC, who have 3% of the student body, have been told that they're going to shoulder 10% of the education cuts, and it is precisely the programmes targeted at disadvantaged young people who are going to pay that price, and the massive leaps forward in terms of educational standards, the retention of young people in education by precisely funding these programmes with smaller classes, the applied leaving cert, the other inter-cert programmes and so on, schemes to allow traveller children participate and so on, SNA provision and all of these. These are the things that the schools are going to have to cut from that. So I do think we need to look at this, and any points being made as they are in this about dealing with disadvantage have to be put in the bigger context, as well of what's happening with regard to SNAs and so on as well, where I believe that the Minister is even talking about removing the right to appeal that parents have in that regard, which would be absolutely disastrous. So when we talk about combating disadvantage and that the abolition of this committee being a part of that overall battle, I have to say it is weakened by the attacks that are being made on precisely the most disadvantaged young people and students in society. I think in terms of the Teaching Council, it is something as well that has obviously been highlighted. The bill and the digest gave us a list of functions of what the Teaching Council is, what it's supposed to do and all the rest. I think for most people would see it maybe, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but as a sort of a glorified organisation for vetting of teachers by the Gardaí, and some would question really the need for that organisation to exist as an independent body. And I do think we really need to look at it. what its role is and what purpose does it serve. And I do think in that context this bill is a little bit of a lost opportunity that doesn't really go far enough to my mind. And one of the key questions I would have to reiterate is, why do unemployed and part-time teachers have to fund this body? You know, the reality is now in this state it's not possible to get a job as a teacher unless you're registered. The fact that that comes at a cost of €90 per year, particularly if you're unemployed, to me is absolutely outrageous. And I think the figures speak for themselves. The fact that over 3,000 people refused or didn't re-register last year tells a certain tale in the fact that it does put an economic burden on people that I think is totally unnecessary. I mean, why are we talking about an annual registration fee anyway? Why isn't it every 3 years? Why isn't it every 5 years? You know, if it is necessary to register every year, well, why do you need to charge for it every year? Really, when you read this, you're thinking, actually, the only purpose of this full stop is as a revenue generating mechanism, because no other explanation, to be honest, makes any huge sense. Now, the only reason I've seen advanced is this idea, well, we need to make it self-financing, we need to get the funding for it. And I would again question, well, why? Why should the cost of that self-financing be borne by the teachers themselves, particularly the unemployed and part-time teachers, when it's the employer who gains from their professionalism? The employer being the Department of Education, to my mind, should be funding this service that deals with this area rather than the individual teachers themselves. I think this does beg the question as well, is, well, if that is the case, that the department should be funding it, well, why couldn't the department do the work themselves within their own departmental buildings? Why do we need a separate premises in Maynooth? What are the salaries of the top people in the Teaching Council? I do think we need to dig deep on these issues and look at it if we're talking about streamlining, and as if the bill says, if it is part of an overall cost-saving package, why don't we look at that? Why don't we look at the material that the Teaching Council send out? The letter that it sends out to its members, the type of paper that's used is quite incredible. It is full cover, really heavy, embossed, expensive paper of a graphic design character that I believe, I don't know for a fact, but I'm told it is of you obviously haven't seen it, Deputy. It's of a quality that I don't think is printed in Ireland. You can make the point when you speak yourself in a minute. Fair play to you. So you can make that point yourself. In your own contribution, you can make that point. The point I'm raising is that why do we need to have that? The Teaching Council sends out a receipt and a letter to 73,000 people at a minimum cost of 55 cents in postage, not including the cost of the heavy, unusual paper that they send out. What is this about? That's the guts of €38,500 in postage alone. Now, I mean, you know, I think we can take it that all these teachers are online. What about the smart economy? What about online receipts? What is the, if we're talking about avoiding waste and being more efficient, well then presumably these functions could be done out a lot more smartly than they are being done at the moment, and we could save expense there rather than foisting that burden onto teachers, many of whom are without a job. I note that the Teaching Council says in their material that this has really been done now, that registered teachers can now see themselves as sort of registered professionals similar to doctors, architects, engineers, nurses and so on. But I have to say that's absolutely nonsense. Teachers are not self-employed sole traders requiring professional indemnity insurance. They're employees, essentially. And the question of continuing professional development is hugely important to teachers, but one which they have taken on board themselves and have had a constant input into that regard. I think there's a huge desire amongst teachers for an increase in professionalism and for that to take place on a continued basis, but that can be done through programmes like the in-service courses and so on. I think making that compulsory, making ongoing development of teaching standards, and I think there is a real will within the teaching profession and the teaching community to do that within our education service. You don't need a teaching council to actually achieve that or anything like that. I think it is important to tackle the issue of casualisation, of the fact that qualified teachers should not be on the dole while unqualified people are being employed in their jobs. I know we're saying that this can only be done now. in exceptional circumstances, but I'm not actually sure that the bill achieves that, and I know some other points will be made by my colleague in that regard. The last point I want to make, Ceann Comhairle, is with regard to